write like a man. Use a typewriter.
What are your thoughts upon the second incursion and how it relates to, maybe what Rob's treatment of it was and what Michael's treatment of it is?
Yeah, so when we're talking about how giants survived the flood.
Yeah.
Yes.
How they show up after the flood.
Right.
And before we get into that, just let me say that Nephilim, which shows up in Genesis 6:4, in the Hebrew word Nephil, I am is the male plural, only shows up 2 other times after the flood.
Really?
That's in Numbers 13:33.
Right.
Where it twice calls the Anakim, the Anak people, the Anakites, as being the children of giants, which is the Hebrew word Nephil. That's in the evil part of the report.
Yeah.
And that was something we have to be aware of. So, and for me, this is what I'd like to make people clear on it before we get into how giants survived the flood, is that all the other times in the Old Testament, other than those 3 places where the word is giant, except for one, it's in Job where it goes back to Gibor or Gibborim, which is usually a word used to describe the giants, but it doesn't have to. It can mean strong, or it can be mighty. It can describe angels. It can describe the strength of God, the mighty ones of David. So you have to apply it to the proper application again. Is the Hebrew word Rapha 7497, which means giant, and plural is Rephaim. And Rephaim show up in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15 as a people. And the word Rapha and Rephaim combined show up 25 times in the Old Testament. So it's used a lot.
Yeah.
Right? But the Anakim were not the Nephilim. The Anakim, as in Deuteronomy 2, is describing them as giants, which goes back to the Hebrew word Rapha and Rephaim, just as all the Avim in there, the Horim, the Emim, they're all Rephaim. They're all branches of the Rephaim. And the patriarch for the Anakim and Joshua is Arba. And Arba is not in the table of nations.
Oh, that's
because only names of people who are of the offspring of Noah are in the table of nations that give you the 70. So then you get 9 patriarchs in the Canaanites. You get named 3 of them, which are Canaan, Heth, and Sidon. The rest are patriarchless. So I think that the patriarchs are Rephaim. They created human hybrids. These are the taller people that are recorded in Deuteronomy 1 and Numbers 13 that are amongst the Anak kings in Numbers 13:33 and described in Deuteronomy 1 where all the accurate details are confirmed.
Yeah.
And so you got 2 separate peoples, and those peoples were including like the Amalekites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and a few other tribes. These are the taller ones. These are from the patriarchless tribes. And the Canaanites would have had their daughters marry in. And I'm going to cover this in detail in my book that's going to come out next year. But anyways, I'm going down too many rabbit holes here for you. So these,
that's okay.
So these were not the Anak were not the children of the Nephilim. They were actually described as what was being seen by the scouts as 3 Anakim kings, which were Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, who were the sons of the Anakim. So what was going on here in Numbers 13:33 is the terrified 10 scouts didn't want to go in and fight these people that were taller than them, and they're known as the Shazu or the Shamau or the Amau, depending on whether you're coming from sort of an Aryan sort of language or the Egyptians as the Shazu. They were thought to be 6 to 9 feet tall, and the Rephaim were taller. These were the hybrid humans. And they didn't want to go in and fight these monsters, so they wanted to scare people. So they knew the Anakim were like Goliath, which would have been 9 feet 9 to 11 feet 12 feet tall, depending on the cubit, or Og, let's put him at 12 to 14 feet based
Yeah.
on his bed size.
Yeah.
As opposed to the hybrids, which were taller, as described in Deuteronomy 1, as opposed to just stronger and mightier. You actually get the word taller as larger in Deuteronomy 1, which confirms the details. But these three were the sons of Anak.
Yeah.
Right? So they embellished it to Nephilim to scare the people. But what it did do was it resonated with the people because they were aware of,
It was a cultural reference point for him.
yeah, who the
I see.
Nephilim were.
Okay. Yeah.
And
right.
that we get from that the Nephilim were larger than the Rephaim because they were like grasshoppers embellished.
As tall as cedar trees. Yeah.
And the cedar trees, which is an embellishment because it's talking about the Amorites, which would have been, 40 to 100 feet tall.
Right.
But that's a simile. That was just referencing to the giant trees of the forest, which were the cedar trees that were used in all the buildings around the ancient world. So they were making a reference that they knew the connotation that the Israelites would take from that because they were aware of the antediluvian giants, which were bigger.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So you get a confirmation of the veracity of Genesis 6:4, even though it's used in an evil report or a bad report or an inaccurate report, depending on how you want to phrase it. So if we understand that, what we do know is giants show up after the flood.
Right.
So then the question is how do they? I know it was a long ways to get there. Hopefully it was an interesting tourist route, but we got there.
Well, I had never thought of any of that before. That's awesome information. Yeah. But please continue. Yeah.
I put it into three buckets of possibilities because we're not told how. We're told only in Genesis 6:1-4 that when the sons of God went to the daughters of men, and they did so again afterwards. We're not told when afterwards. And it probably means again after wherever they did the creation of the giants, because we only know the oath was sworn on Mount Hermon. We're not told where they actually created them.
Yeah.
The sons of God's oath on Mount Hermon. So there could have been other incursions by more than the 200 as Enoch numbers them afterwards before the flood. But it could also mean, again, after the flood. And what's really interesting about that is that you have parent gods in polytheism and you have offspring gods. And so if we're talking about parent god, in Greek mythology it would be like Kronos and Gaia, and offspring gods are Zeus.
Yeah.
Now, the offspring gods are around both before and after the flood. The parent gods aren't. So you go over to the Canaanite pantheon, you get the same thing with El, who's the father of Baal, and the Baalim, who's reigning from Mount Hermon. So El's gone, but Baal's still there. What sort of tells me is from an interesting standpoint, which will start to fit when we look into three buckets. Okay, so just keep that for a frame of mind. So the three buckets are, my least favorite one was, and we have to be open to all because we're not exactly told how. We're only shown that they do. So we don't want to just write everything off just because I have a favorite of three in the groupings. Is somehow on the ark. And that is either like in Jewish and Gnosticism mythology, you have Og or Tubal-Cain being a stowaway, or other giants being a stowaway on the ark, right? Or on another ark, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Pishtan, and you get all sorts of mythologies about that. Somehow on the ark also would include some of the wives being giants.
Right, that's the one I don't
having that DNA. Yeah, I've heard that.
And also in Gnosticism, all of them were giants, or just the sons were giants. I mean, there's lots of different versions in terms of how they sort of get there. The DNA item one is interesting, but I struggle with the aspect of holding the DNA from the giants if God was preserving the purity of the stock. I have a better understanding on the DNA that he would have had included within the wives, because we don't get the genealogy of the wives, DNA that would include the other races, so that you would have now why you have 4 races showing up again after the flood. That would make more sense to me. I'm not sure how you can get both of that to mix in, but having said that, we don't know, so that's a possibility. But that's my least favorite. And then people will say that, well, that's because the DNA came out in the Canaanites. But then you've got all this interesting conflicts with the hybrids and the patriarchless tribes that, that when you take that back to Hebrew, when it says the families of Canaan, it can mean families, but it can also mean a different kind, a different species.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah. So
now you're really getting into it.
The language doesn't pinpoint it. It leaves it open.
Yeah. So it makes more sense to me that they would take their names from Rephaim names, just as Arba was the father of the Anak. There would be sort of an etymological link there, and there is a lot of that. And I go through that in my book, and I didn't deal with that in the first book because it was long enough as it is, but I wasn't sure people were kind of ready for some of this stuff. So anyways, that's a possibility. The next bucket is, again, somehow fallen angels have them survive, whether or not they provide them another ark, whether or not it's on top of a mountain where they protect them, whether they take them off the earth or in the earth, somehow they help them. Just as if we have beings that were saved from the Nakash, or let's say the little people, or some of the other things in sort of the mix of the genre of
shelter.
Of different types of beings, that they could have saved them as well. That's a possibility. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we get ark stories all around the world, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Gilgamesh, who is created after the flood, along with Anakim, and Gilgamesh is like 6 generations. So and he's the son of Lugalbanda, so we get his genealogy. So he's not from before the flood. There may have been a giant named Gilgamesh before the flood, but this is clearly a different one. And you have also in the Epic of Gilgamesh the story of the flood with Utnapishtim and all of his family, who were also, like Gilgamesh and Anakim, were 2/3 God and 1/3 human. So they are Nephilim. So that's a Nephilim survival story that comes from polytheism. And whether or not that's true or not, they see the ark through polytheism. So whether or not it is in the Greek mythology with Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are the Greek Noahs, and Noah's wife, not a chance. Because Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, which is either a Nephilim or a god, because they're named as both in Greek mythology. So that makes Deucalion a Nephilim. So it's a Nephilim survival story again. So that's somehow with the help of angels. And then it's second incursion, which is my most favorite one. Although I'm more open to somehow by the fallen angels than I am somehow on the ark. But second incursion makes more sense to me in terms of being, you don't have to sort of get real legalistic with the wording in the Bible. But you could make the case somehow by the fallen angels where they help them, because what the wording was is that God was only going to kill and destroy everything on the earth that he created except for the 8 and those that were on the ark. And that leaves open to the idea that if the angels took those beings somewhere else in the earth or off the earth or some other dimension or whatever, that it still doesn't sort of, distort what's written. But what's interesting, though, is that God was only wanting to have beings that weren't that weren't degraded. So that when the whole earth was corrupt, that's the Hebrew word shakath. And that means spoiled, ruined, decayed. That means all of the plants. That means all of the animals, and all but for the 8 that went on the ark, both spiritually and physically. And God knew which ones they were and called all the animals to the ark, which makes sense. That would be the best representatives. And kind is that word for species, different than families, but means species, and in the applications is used that way. He would have known the ones that weren't destroyed. right? And those
Yeah.
were what was saved. So why would you have contaminated DNA
Right.
in the wives?
Interesting.
It defeats the
So,
purpose.
so second incursion makes the most sense for me. That you now have giants that are smaller than the Nephilim,
Yeah.
from what we talked about earlier, somehow distinct, somehow, and why they're called Rephaim instead of Nephilim. And
Yeah.
if the parent gods were sent to the abyss for their crimes, as Jude 1:6, 2 Peter 2:4, and 1 Peter seem to indicate, then if there was a second incursion, then those angels, fallen gods after the flood, would also go to the abyss. And that's why the Baalim disappear, the whole pantheon of gods. And if you look at it from
Can I ask you a
angelic
question about that? I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you a question about that?
Yep.
Because I've looking back through those verses. I mean, there's a verse in First Peter, there's a verse in Second Peter, of course, there's the verse in Jude, and then the account in Genesis 6. God punishes the angels that commit that sin, the sons of God.
Yeah.
He punishes them, sends them to the abyss where they're locked away until the end.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't. There's nothing that is explicit that says he punished those angels right when they committed the sin.
Oh.
In the Bible, there's nothing that says when he sends them to the abyss. Could they have committed this second incursion and then be sent to the abyss?
If you look at First Peter and if you look at Second Peter, in those passages, read the passages right after. It's all connected to the time of the flood when they were put into the prisons. You have to read the larger context, right? That's where you get that sort of connection. And in Jude 6, they left their habitation when they sinned. And habitation is the Greek word oiketerion, which means a dwelling place for the spirit. And so you only get oiketerion twice in the New Testament, once in Jude 1:6 for habitation, and in 2 Corinthians 5:2 for the house, which is oiketerion, that's in heaven. It's a dwelling place for the spirit, just as Jesus promised us God has many mansions for us in heaven. So at that, before the resurrections happen, you have a dwelling place for the spirit, and you have a dwelling place on earth for a spirit as well. And that's part of what we're made up which is the body, the soul, and the spirit. And the spirit comes from heaven that only God and Jesus can separate. And so that body and that soul is the oiketerion, the dwelling place for the spirit in the physical world. Not that angels have to have a physical oiketerion. They can be a spiritual presence, an opalescent presence, but to physically interact in the world, they need to create a body so that they can talk, drink, whatever. And it seems that they would be permitted to do that, just as with angels in the Sodom narrative and visiting with Abraham are humans, and we get a human in Daniel and one other place. We get examples of them actually interacting physically, eating, drinking, talking, touching. So they have the ability to do that. That is not illegal. But to violate the laws of creation and to have sex to create a counterfeit spirit and an immortal spirit in the physical world in a physical body broke the laws of creation. And all life comes from the Spirit of God at God's command, which is the Holy Spirit. And that's the sin that you can't commit, because nothing can save you, as what we're told in Matthew. And so we get those sort of connections in there, but you got to dig a little bit deeper and connect all of the passages that are connected. And so when you have the parent gods leaving, if you understand that the hierarchy amongst the angels is understood as a hierarchy when you have the word host, which is used in association with stars and angels and the sons of God. Saba is the Hebrew word for host, and that means an army of angels.
The angelic host.
Yes, and within an army you have a hierarchy. And so when the parent gods left, the offspring gods stepped up and took over. And all around the world, you get these parent gods dying in polytheism, which they're immortal, they can't die.
Right.
And that these offspring gods overthrow them and then they take over. They didn't overthrow them. They just didn't create the giants before the flood. They created them after the flood is, I guess, where I'm going with that.
But these angels that kind of stepped into that, the parent angels had been punished, and then the flood comes along, and then after the flood, there are still angels. But are these fallen angels specifically that step into that role? Or are they not yet fallen?
Yes, they are fallen angels because they're the offspring gods, right? Whether or not they were physically made from two angels before, or that's just the allegory of sort of the rank and sort of the mythology that sort of gets written into it, because everything in polytheism is allegorical. You have to dig deeper to get to the true meaning. Right? And they give you the fairy tale story up the top, but you have to be an adept to understand everything sort of underneath. Right. So when you have the angels that go to the abyss, not all the angels went to the abyss. Satan didn't go to the abyss. True. And only the ones that were probably created, the crimes against humanity and the earth and against the Holy Spirit, they went to the abyss. And we get an example of that even with the demonic spirits, which I think are the Nephilim, because you have these spirits are permitted to go to sleep and they aren't permitted to go to heaven because they're a counterfeit spirit. And I got to have document on this just as I do for second incursion for people, and the one on the Oikotarian as well. So if people want that, just get a hold of me. I'll send you those documents. But yet we get in Ezekiel 32 with these spirits that are talking to Pharaoh. And this is also a prophecy. It's one of those prophecies that I call the dual prophecy, that has important information in prehistory that you need to understand what's going on at the time of the prophet and in the end time. And it's a prophecy for the life of that prophet or shortly thereafter, and for the end time, with implications and sort of a repeat sort of mechanism. You got these spirits that are talking to the Pharaoh, and they're in the cells along the sides of the abyss, separate prisons than the abyss. And they're called the terrible ones, who did terrible things on earth. And the ones who were slain and weren't permitted to wander, weren't permitted to sleep, weren't permitted into heaven. These are the ones, the terrible ones, that are taken to the abyss. And it's talking to other terrible ones on earth, in this case, Pharaoh. And it's not just terrible ones that are used in Ezekiel. It's in Isaiah, and it's in a number of other chapters. And so
books that we never read, Isaiah, Ezekiel, we never hear those in church.